Great. Okay. Welcome, James. I'm joined by James Esses. Is that how I say your name?
It is very good. Most
Well,
people call me also. I get James Essex a lot, and for people who don't like me that much, it's James Asses.
James Asses.
Yeah.
Uh, James, you're a therapist and writer. You've become a prominent voice in debates around therapy, safeguarding, and freedom of thought within the therapy professions. You originally trained as a barrister before becoming a therapist, and your experience at the intersection of law and mental health gives you a really unique perspective on the challenges facing practitioners, especially at the moment as things get more and more tricky. You founded Just Therapy, which is a directory where people can find non-ideological therapists, of which I'm a member myself. Um, so thanks for coming. I've got you on to address a specific topic and hopefully share some of your own experience as someone who
Mm.
successfully challenged ideological thinking in the therapy professions. My what I want to talk about today is how how is a man who is a trainee therapist supposed to comport himself when he is going through training? Because we're asked to be authentic and congruent, but we're also asked to do things uh, uh, that might encourage us to not be congruent. And there's this feeling of there can be a feeling of an axe hanging over one's head. So to pass the course, I'm sharing this because I recently had a client, an old client, come back to me, and he was worried about how to how to behave on his training. He didn't know how to strike that balance. So you, I guess you're someone who doesn't take any prisoners, James. Would you mind just telling us a little bit about what I mean there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can empathize with your old client because it does feel as and I reflect back to my own training program. It does feel as if you're expected to put on a bit of a mask at times because there are
Mm,
some views, opinions, personality traits that aren't welcome, at least in the kind of modern era of psychotherapy training. Um, I mean, the vast majority of people trained to be therapists these days are women anyway. And I look, I don't play identity politics, so I don't particularly that it doesn't bother me in and of itself. But it's interesting that traditionally, if you think about the founding fathers of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, etc., it was predominantly men. Now it's completely inversed. Um, I didn't see any of my colleagues on my course, or indeed on any of the other courses I'm aware of, complain about the fact that there weren't that many men. But I imagine that if, again, it was reversed and there was a minority of women on the course, they'd be questioning that. So I found that interesting. And
mm,
it was actually kind of odd to be. It was bizarre because I was in a minority on my course, actually, and being a straight man as well put me even to even more of a minority. But at the same time, it was being suggested by the teachings that we were expected to read and by some of my tutors that, well, someone of my uh, identification is inherently privileged, and
mm.
so it's weird, kind of holding that on the one hand, but also I guess feeling like a bit of an outsider. I mean, I was a young straight white man, and there aren't that many trainee therapists that fit that criteria these days. And I do wonder about that. I do wonder what it is that's putting men off, I guess, training as a psychotherapist. I appreciate I'm kind of going off on a slightly different tangent from the initial question that you asked, but
That's
um,
okay. I just to add on to that, I've developed a bit of a personal tradition to send in a resolution to the BACP every time they have an AGM, and um, One of them, I think it was 2024, I started to get a little bit more playful, and I asked if they would be willing to spend any of their EDI budget on recruiting more male trainees, because there was such a shortage, and given that there's a shortage of male clients despite the overwhelming need for to access it. We need to encourage more men to access therapy because they're really struggling and the suicide rates are so high, etc. So yeah, it's a glaring discrepancy, and it's an interesting one that we can be curious about. But there isn't a lot of curiosity in my experience when I was training as well.
No, there's not. And you know, for most services that one could provide, I'm not, again, as I said, I don't play the identity politics game.
Mm,
So my view is that what I care about is competency. I don't care about skin color of whoever's offering the service. I don't care about sex, etc. But with psychotherapy, given some of the issues that people are bringing, it is understandable in my mind for someone to have a preference over whether they would like to speak to a man or a woman. And so, on that basis alone, if there's a real dearth of men, particularly younger men, entering the profession, well, then that could cause issues. You know, so
mm.
so that's the relevance of it. But as you say, nobody's particularly bothered. Nobody's particularly curious about it. Um, yeah, I mean, I generally think about who is attracted to the vocation of psychotherapy these days, and it feels like a very different type of person to what it historically was. I don't know if that's your view as well, but
Yeah, I
you know,
think it is. Yeah.
this morning I actually this I I'm a fellow at the newly formed uh, heterodox academy at the University of Buckingham, and so they get me to kind of review some draft papers and proposals. And I've just this morning I was reading a draft paper um, about activist therapy, which has almost become its own new modality now, and that the therapeutic world is attracting practitioners who view it as their roles to essentially be able to educate people in social justice issues. And that was my reading of it, certainly when I was on my course, in terms of who is being uh, drawn to this field, because there's a lot of power, you know, in it, and clients view you as the expert. And so I think a lot of people enjoy the opportunity to essentially engage in kind of moral grandstanding and to try and bring other people up to where they feel that society should be, rather than actually dealing with the issue that they've come with. You know, and I hear stories time and time again of clients being chastised by their therapists for their political views or otherwise, and that's really
Yeah.
telling.
I uh, I'm as you're saying that, I'm remembering a client I once had who he came to me to really to navigate his relationship with his wife, but he shared some horrible experiences in couples therapy with her in the past. And one therapist had told him that she thought he needed to change the way he managed his staff at work. And yet he told me that his staff really liked him, and there wasn't any problems with his relationships with his staff. But somehow the couples therapist felt that it was appropriate for her to take a view on that. I mean, he was working in an industry that uh, I don't need to put too fine a point on it, but it was a masculine industry, not a masculine industry. It was to do with defense, and there's a culture in the forces and in ex-forces personnel that he could really resonate with people in that kind of milieu, but she just didn't get it. And instead of being curious, she said that it was wrong. And I think that's maybe slightly what can happen to trainees when they go into training to become a therapist. There's people, there's lecturers, there's tutors that feel there's whole areas of behavior and presentation as a man that are just not appropriate. Is that fair to
Yeah,
say?
I, I think so, and I think that can be seen across the rest of society.
Yeah.
I also
Yeah.
find it interesting that the way in which masculinity now is presented as being inherently toxic. It's interesting. Again, look, I can only speak on my own experience, but if I think about both on my training course as a therapist, or if I think about some of the jobs I've held, for example, in civil service departments over the years, the men that I've encountered, including men who are quite senior, are actually, I would describe as meek,
Mm.
very like very pleasant, almost perhaps trying too hard to be nice, but very meek and quite quiet. And a lot of the women that I've encountered in senior roles have been the complete opposite. They've been what men used to be accused of being, which was quite bullish, taking no
Mm.
prisoners, very direct, sometimes getting quite angry or aggressive. Again, this is just my own personal experience of it. Similarly on my psychotherapy course, again, a lot of the guys very smiley, very friendly, want to placate situations, and actually a lot of the kind of group ruptures, etc. There was a lot of energy coming from the women on the course that wasn't coming from the men, and I just think that I think a lot of guys are absolutely terrified of doing or saying the wrong thing and then being jumped on for it. So now they're really on guard, um,
Mm.
and I think at the same time, girls in society have been told that you can be whatever you want to be, and you should be the way that men historically were. And we just smash that patriarchy, and you should be the boss and the leaders of tomorrow. And I think it's just it basically feels like a complete role reversal, actually. But it doesn't seem particularly healthy because there's still extremes. But now often it's the men who are being, as I said, meek and almost subservient to the women. I'm sure I'll get chastised by some people for saying that, but it's what I've observed, and
Mm.
I think it kind of flies in the face of this notion that we were trying to create a sense of equality across society. But if you're lambasting half of the population for something out of their control, i.e., the fact that they were born male, that's not going to bring about equality, is it? So,
Yeah, it sometimes feels like a vendetta or a equity drive. They want to experience what men used to get rather than have equality
hmm.
now. Yeah.
Well, because people are drawn to everyone. Human beings are drawn to power, and look, I don't like even in the psychotherapy world. Clearly, there were issues in the past, right? And I think it probably was at one point a bit of a boys' club, and that's not good either. I do want to try and reduce barriers for people who want to pursue a vocation in life and feel that they're not able to for whatever reason. I do want to open up pathways for that, but um, and I think women in the workplace have not been treated well in the past either.
Mm.
Very much have been burned by their experiences. So I can understand why a lot of women feel aggrieved and want to turn the tables now. I just don't think that's necessarily in everyone's interests.
Mm. But I think you're less circumspect when it comes to children and child protection.
Yes. Yeah.
Could you tell us the story of what happened when you were at Metanoia training to be a psychotherapist?
Yeah, well, I'd been volunteering at Childline for a few years, so I was coming into contact on a weekly basis with children, young children saying they were trans. It's not really something I'd come across before. I was probably a bit sheltered from it all, but that was on my radar. I was doing some reading and research. I was aware that there was this notion of this memorandum of understanding that therapists were expected to sign up to on conversion therapy, and that the government was planning on banning conversion therapy. So I was trying to read into that, and I was becoming quite concerned that essentially therapists were being forced to go against their own ethics, um, and affirm this notion of gender identity and affirm children who come to them and say that they want to medically transition and become the other sex. And so I got together with a group of other practitioners, long established practitioners, and we formed a group called Thoughtful Therapists at the time in 2021. And I wrote a petition to the government asking them to not go ahead with the ban on conversion therapy. I wrote to UKCP quite querying the MOU. I'd actually written an article and I asked whether they would publish it in their journal. Um, and basically things snowballed very, very quickly, and complaints were made to Metanoia about me and about the egregious things that I'd been saying and doing. And within a matter of weeks of those complaints going in, I was expelled from the course and I was taken off the UKCP trainee register. Um, and then ensued 3 to 4 years of litigation against both Metanoia and UKCP, both of which resulted in settlements, which was obviously good for me, although there's a part of me that wishes I'd gone all the way with it, because I don't feel they got punished actually quite
What
as
would that have looked? What would that have looked like, James? Going all the
it,
way.
it would have gone to an employment tribunal. Uh, it would have been a pretty lengthy hearing. I think a week or 2 weeks. I would have had an opportunity via my barrister to cross-examine some senior figures in both organizations. That would have been extremely enjoyable to watch, and see them sweat a bit. I would have been cross-examined myself. I wasn't afraid of. I was looking forward to that opportunity to actually put my case forward, but I was crowdfunding the litigation. It wasn't my money. It was people's generosity. You can never predict how these cases are going to go. We have a strong
Mm,
case. My lawyers thought we would win, but you never know. And I just thought uh, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, and I thought I'll be sensible about it and offer them an opportunity to show contrition and see if that changes anything. And it appears that absolutely nothing has changed since, which is quite disheartening. In fact, in some
mm,
ways, it seems to have gotten worse.
mm. Okay. Um, so quite a depressing picture, really, for someone, for a young man going into the profession, would you say?
I mean, I'm completely disillusioned with the profession as a whole. I love the
Mm,
work, and I'm very thankful that I've been able to set up my own practice and I can work with clients every day. I mean, there's nothing better in many ways as far as I'm concerned. But the profession as a whole, the community, you know, I'm extremely concerned about. And I chose not to go back and complete the training course because, well, certainly wouldn't have been at Metanoia, but I chose not to go back and train anywhere else because I could imagine the same thing would happen again
mm,
because my views aren't changing. Um, and so as a result of that, I'm not registered with UKCP or any of the other bodies, and that causes limitations. Thankfully, because I've got somewhat of an existing platform, I can advertise my services through social media and pick up clients that way, but I can't advertise through any of the normal channels. So for other young trainees in a similar position and with similar views to withdraw from the accreditation scheme and to try and go as alone is extremely difficult. So you're forced into a
mm,
position where you almost have to go along with this stuff, because if you're not willing to go along with this memorandum of understanding on conversion therapy, for example, you simply cannot be accredited by the bodies that are signed up to it, and your career is all dead in the water before it's even begun. So I get a lot of trainees reach out to me and say, I don't know what to do. I want to be true to myself, but I don't want to scupper my chances of qualifying and practicing. And it's a real dilemma.
mm. Do you have any advice for people in that situation?
I always try and take a very balanced view of it, and I always emphasize to people that they have to do what feels right to them, which may
Mm,
sound like a cop out, and I guess it is, but I don't view it as my place to tell them what to do because their circumstances might be very different to mine. I was able to do this, but they might not. They literally might not be able to do it if they're financially dependent on this, for example. And not everyone can crowdfund litigation. So um,
mm,
so I try and look at it through both sides. I always make the point that I have zero regrets, that I can sleep soundly at night, and that to me, these issues are too important to not speak up about. But I also make the point to them that if all the decent trainee therapists speak out and get themselves thrown off courses, then we'll only be left with the loony therapist, and that's not in anyone's interests. And for some people, it makes more sense to keep their head down, get the qualification, start practicing, and then speak when they're in a position of power.
Mm.
That does make sense to me. But I'm very, as you can probably tell, Zach, I'm very conflicted on this because, I think back again to my own training program, and I wish some of my cohort had spoken out in my defense. And I had a number of friends who privately, would come to me and say they supported me, but they wouldn't dare utter a word publicly or to the institution. And so that's in part what allowed that to happen. I would say if my entire group came out and said, okay, we may not agree with what James said, but we agree with his right to be able to voice it, and we should have these debates as a community and as a profession, they probably wouldn't have kicked me off, I would imagine. But, they chose not to do that.
It's really remarkable, isn't it, that we're having this conversation, because almost the first thing you learn as a trainee, or at least I did, I was doing person-centered, was that you create conditions of non-judgmental conditions, empathy, and meeting the client where they are. So this idea that we're in a job which is about re-educating people just immediately clashes with that. And that's really the main point, isn't it? It just comes up in different guises, but we're meant to be we're meant to be professionals who are able to sit with our clients and really meet them. But if we don't, but if we're bringing politics and ideology into the therapy room, that's a completely different animal. It's grotesque. And that's all you were saying. And no one, your colleagues, your peers didn't stand up and say, yeah, he's right. Or he has a legitimate concern. At least he has the right to voice this concern, because we're meant to be curious professionals here. We're meant to explore ideas and think in different modalities.
Yeah, well, it's one of the first things you learn about on a training course. I learned, my foundation certificate before you've even started the course proper, about bracketing your own views, opinions, emotions, trying to set that to one side. And that's what this is about, I continue to practice what I preach through my own client work. I mean, because politics does come up, clients will make comments, but it's not I quite like Donald Trump. I've made that clear in some of my writing before. I had a client the other day who essentially said that he said he kind of thinks that people who vote Donald Trump are idiots, right? But now, of course, in the moment I hear that, and there's there's a little pang, and like, oh shit, my client thinks I'm an idiot, and am I an idiot? And then you do spiral for a few seconds, and then I quickly catch myself and I say, it doesn't matter. This isn't relevant. How I feel about it is irrelevant. He is entitled to that view. Now, if he said it and I thought that actually he's developing a narrative that's particularly unhelpful and is holding him back in life, then I might raise it from that perspective. If he's making black or white statements about and splitting people off into segments or whatever, but it was just a throwaway remark, unconnected to what the work we were doing was. And so I put it to one side. I don't think any differently of him. I'm not offended. But I mean, God, some of the people that I trained with, if a client made a comment that was, completely the opposite to what their political viewpoint was, I mean, they would crumble. They would actually crumble. Therapists actually need a certain degree of resilience, and well, they definitely need resilience and strength. Again, I feel that the profession is attracting people who are vulnerable and fragile. it's not good. You have to be able to hold your own emotions as well as those of your clients. And if you crumble because you've got some sort of fragile sense of self and ego, then you should, my view is you shouldn't be a therapist. Full stop. Um,
Okay, so maybe now we're getting to it a bit then. So if someone is faced with these training institutions as they are now,
hmm,
maybe we could frame it as an opportunity to develop the resilience needed for the work long term, because there's going to be more nonsense thrown at us
mhm.
as professionals, almost certainly, and we need to be able to uh, take a reasonable position and show our workings without getting very activated, and being able to stay grounded. And so um, that's very difficult to do if someone else who's being provocative has the power to cut off your chance of getting the qualification you need to get income. But nevertheless, you've demonstrated that if you use the law, if you do hold people to account, uh, they are bound by these rules in the end.
In the end, but I was very fortunate. A lot of things came together, as I said, to enable me to even pursue that course. I think for most people, it just wouldn't be a possibility. So these
Mm.
these people in positions of authority wield a lot of power. Um, it's also, I guess, at the time I thought this is one of the great things about psychotherapy training, but now I look back and I do question it to some extent. The fact that you even got things like group process. I mean, most training courses of whatever type, university or postgraduate, you don't you don't have baked into the course a formal opportunity for people to sit in a circle and at times literally just tell each other what they think about them and have a go at other people and insult them and argue. And I mean, it's fascinating, but it brings out the worst in people as well. And
Mm.
uh, yeah, I think it's useful because you can see the way the human mind really works. But it also provides an opportunity for people to gang up, um, and to take
Mm.
sides and to cast aspersions and to portray certain people as, allies or enemies. I certainly felt that in my own group process. I mean, at times I felt like I was carrying the entire, we talk about the shadow. So, I mean, I felt like I was the shadow of the entire group, um, which I didn't mind trying to be authentic in that way. I wasn't going to hide parts of myself, but it's to what end? I don't actually, now that I look back at it, I don't know whether that group process and the way it's currently run kind of helps or hinders. And again, actually, a lot tutors are meant to just stay back and facilitate in a neutral manner. But some of the tutors on my course were getting stuck in, and they were also picking battles and taking sides, which felt very unprofessional as well.
Mm.
When did you train?
I qualified in 2018. I'm just thinking about my process group now,
Hmm.
and it was actually all right, but there was another one going concurrently, and there was all sorts of strange things going on there. People refusing to, in the end, it sort of split in half, and half of the people refused to carry on unless uh, other people were removed. It was
It's,
like being at primary school. It was
No,
amazing.
it's pathetic. There were petitions doing the rounds because all of the rooms were named after, again, some of the kind of forefathers of
Oh
psychotherapy.
yeah.
But there were petitions doing the rounds saying that they weren't diverse enough and trying to get like Freud's name taken off a room or something. There was a tutor on my course who I actually quite liked, and she was a lesbian. And I still haven't quite wrapped my head around what this was about, but one of the cohorts said that the fact that she hadn't been open about her lesbian identity meant that she was hiding a part of herself and wasn't role modeling the way the therapist should be congruent. So they actually wrote a letter, I think, criticizing her for not owning her sexuality. It's bonkers.
Yeah. It is concerning, isn't it? That these people are now out there. Well, most of them probably are out there receiving good money to help people who feel they can't, they don't know how to live well.
It's terrifying.
Yeah.
And this was, for me, this was never coming from a place of me thinking, God, I'm such a great therapist. I wish everyone else could be like me. It was actually from a place of neutrality. I thought I was okay. I've got some good points. I've got some bad points. I've got a lot to learn, and I will never stop learning in this profession. But I was looking around at many of my colleagues, and I was thinking, I don't trust them with clients. Um, and I've seen a similar thing when I've engaged with more experienced practitioners. I mean, a few years ago, I was asked to give a talk to the Society of Existential Analysis on some of the trans stuff. And some of the people there were so triggered by my attendance that they had to arrange this emergency safe space that ran at the same time as my talk. Um, it's just, and I found myself chuckling about how ludicrous it was. But then when I really thought about it, I thought this is worrying. If therapists need a safe space because my face produces such terror in their eyes, they can't bear to be in the same building as me.
But this is the kind of thing that I hear a lot about through my clients as well. So it's happening at these different levels, isn't it? So someone, a married couple, one of the partners might say, I feel fearful about how you're going about something you might do or how you might react. They can say that even while acknowledging that the other person has never actually done anything abusive or that there's no pattern there, but they can just really they can really get into this feeling of fear and then create a kind of reality around that that then can affect all sorts of things. And that's just kind of making reality out of feelings that
Yeah.
surely we have a responsibility to model that has while feelings are really worth exploring, at some point we have to take a balanced view and be curious about reality rather than just only receiving this information and acting according. I mean, that's just not an adult way of being in the world.
I completely agree. And I probably spend more time telling the clients not to trust every thought that pops into their head and every feeling that they exhibit.
Mm.
And some of them, when I say it, they they look a bit back. They can't believe I might have said something like that, because surely as a therapist, I want to be leaning into feelings all the time. But that's the problem again. The narrative we developed is always trust your feelings, and your truth, speak your truth and your lived experience. And you've got this unique perception of yourself in the world that no one else can ever have. And so, whereas we know that thoughts don't necessarily mean anything. They do sometimes, but they don't sometimes. They can appear at random. Feelings can be completely off. And depending on what your own context is, what you've been through in the past, you can be, as you just said there, people can perceive threat when none truly exists, right? So people should not always be automatically believing how they feel. I think a good starting point is people should always challenge what they think or feel. And if they still feel it, fair enough, but at least offer the challenge to begin with. But um, the other problem is that these days, once someone says, this is how I feel, there's no comeback to that. It's like it ends the argument then and there.
That's the holy grail, isn't it? That unimpeachable position of my feelings.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's actually really frightening in the field of domestic abuse and domestic violence and family court because that often then begets a paper trail that is just that becomes the reality because someone has said that they feel that. And it's untethered from the other person's behavior often.
This is it because, feelings don't require evidence. As I said, because lived experience is prized. Um, so yes, it can cause issues in all sorts of ways, and but it's very easy to slip into these patterns. I slip into these patterns myself with my wife. If I'm arguing with my wife, I find myself. Honestly, I think I mean, I kind of cringed as I said it, and I quickly repented and vowed never to do it again. But I think at one point I said, "Well, that's just how I felt," or something. That's how you made me feel, or something.
Oof.
Just like I couldn't believe those words came out of my mouth. But in the moment, it's so tempting to say it because you know it's going to win the battle for you. So it's I can see the temptation, but I wish people would be willing to try and challenge themselves more on it because it doesn't help anyone.
Mm. Yeah, so maybe therapy is supposed to be about bringing challenge and encouraging and modeling a higher standard of of self-inquiry and behavior in the world. And what we're observing is that the therapy professions are, as a whole, going the other way.
I mean, if you've got the British Psychological Society publishing papers through a frame of, and this is their own words, anti-whiteness. I mean, I,
Oh yeah, a uh, non-oppressive practice, anti-oppressive practice.
that's it. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Anti, and anytime the word anti is put in front of things these days, normally means that's what they. I mean, I now call them the anti-racist racists because I found many anti-racists to be the biggest racists I've ever encountered. So that's the wordplay there. But yes, I mean, if psychological bodies are putting out stuff like that, and not only alienating their members but also prospective clients and patients, you know, I can't quite believe it, and they're getting away with it because they're a law unto themselves. And with
mm.
psychotherapy, this is again the issue with the fact it's not statutorily regulated. I mean, I'm not saying that that would necessarily solve the problem, and there are also issues with bringing in a regulator, but they just do whatever they want. They're not really answerable to anyone. Myself and my group tried to make complaints against some of the bodies to the Charity Commission, to the Professional Standards Authority, and they do nothing, and they've got no teeth.
Mm. Yeah, I do know several colleagues who are, well, they've gone your way. They're not members of any ethical bodies anymore. But these are established professionals who have been working for a long time. As you say, it's really difficult to do early in a career, unless I guess maybe there's other pathways. I'm thinking of someone who's built up a YouTube following, and she's not associated with the BACP or UKCP, but she's got enough followers that she's got plenty of work that way. But yeah, maybe there's ways around it that we haven't seen yet.
Well, I think litigation is unfortunately going to still play a part. I don't know if you saw there was the article the other day in the Telegraph looking at it was Christian Buckland, who was the former chair of UKCP, and a few other former chairs of some of the accreditation bodies, saying, essentially saying what their concerns are about the ideological capture of the profession, and Christian Buckland talking about the fact that he was ousted essentially after, well, he kind of backed me actually. He was the one who agreed the kind of the settlement with me, and then he
Right.
withdrew UKCP from the MOU on conversion therapy, and he was essentially ousted for it. So um, I can't really say too much at this point, but I and others are now looking at potential legal recourse, because we can go to the newspapers, we can complain to the Charity Commission, we can voice our opinions on social media. We can even cancel our membership, but it doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. So I'm increasingly worried that the therapeutic profession is kind of broken, actually, and it
Mm.
needs. I've been saying to people recently, I feel like a bit of an arsonist, actually. I feel like it needs to be burnt down and then rebuilt again. I'm not
Get
sure.
rid of the
I'm
dead
not sure.
wood.
Yeah.
So when you say legal recourse, what do you mean?
Um, I'm wanting to look particularly at the conversion therapy MOU because that is a cause of much of the anguish for practitioners, because it doesn't allow them to practice in what they deem to be an ethical manner. So I'm looking at what could be done about that, in my view, and I think my legal team's view, it flies in the face of the CAS review, uh,
Hmm.
and all of the evidence we've got as to best practice. So and that document is signed up to not just by some of the therapy bodies, but it's signed up to by NHS England, Scotland, and Wales. So um, I think I'm looking at kind of a public law challenge rather than a employment law or an equalities law, right? Because sure, you can bring employment tribunal cases like I did, but again, that's small fry. That doesn't change the
Yeah.
bigger picture, really. So, I'm looking at what tools we've got from a public law perspective available to us. So you have to watch this space, but I think that could be a possibility, which would be good.
Mm.
Other than that, I don't really know what to do, to be honest. I mean, I've spoken with some other practitioners around trying to set up a rival body, rival accreditation program, training course, and all the rest of it. But I mean, that would be extraordinarily difficult. I, I'm not sure it is possible to compete in this climate because the existing bodies control so much of the market. They're so well established.
Who would you have to get the sign off from to do that? The PSA or what are the bodies that sort of regulate, even though it's not a regulated profession, but how do you get that level of accreditation to be able to be a ethical body?
Well, yes, you probably would want to go down the route of PSA and Charity Commission
Yeah.
accreditation, um, but that's not a foregone conclusion because for example, if you want to work in the NHS, uh, they ask that you are registered with one of X number of bodies, and
Mm.
it's up to the NHS which bodies they recognise as being valid. So similarly with advertising, I've gone on to counselling directory and some of the other online databases for therapists. And again, they ask that you are accredited again by a certain number of set bodies that they've deemed to be acceptable. So who's to say that if you received an accreditation from whatever our new outfit was, that it would even be recognized by them? So it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, I can see why you're thinking of just clearing the clearing the slate. Yeah.
Because I think that this is probably the crucial point, Zach. I think in the country out there, as a whole, there is a silent majority on our side, and they'd be shocked if they knew the full extent of what's happening in the profession, even on, let's say, the trans stuff, for example, which is obviously my main talking point. Clearly, the majority of people are of the same mind as us. But actually, amongst therapists, I actually think we're in the minority.
Oh yeah.
I think
I
most therapists are actually the other way inclined. So you can't work with that then. They're happy that most therapists are not speaking out because they're actually quite content for the status quo to remain. And that's worrying in and of itself. But that's what tells me that we've attracted the wrong therapists, to be honest, which is why I think the whole thing needs to be burnt down and started all over again. It's depressing. It's really
mm,
depressing.
yeah, but maybe it could be exciting. Maybe there's something new can come from all of this. There's I've had clients who have become male clients who have become qualified therapists while I've worked with them, and I've encouraged them just to keep their head down and get through and get get your qualification, and then once you're able to work with people, you can give value in the way that feels right. And I think maybe if we get enough people coming through like that, there'll be yeah, it is bleak. Maybe I'm just trying to make it sound better, but it's difficult. But I do want more young men to get through and get qualified and just at least be around, available to work with the public and have common sense views. So at least there's some sanity available in the
Mm.
market.
Well, I think we need to do more research, and I think some people I know are looking at doing a kind of survey on this, as to why there are more men entering the profession. It'd just be interesting to hear why that is. I think it's probably partly down to fear, and I think it's partly down to perception of what this profession now is. It's become, again, it's become a lot less about academia and philosophy and really thinking and studying, and that's become a lot more now about just feelings. And I think,
Feelings, yeah.
yeah, people expect the therapist to say, "How did that make you feel?" That's the old trope, and it's not incorrect, to some degree, and it's just funny because, like I said, like we said at the top of this conversation, historically you'd have had young women, let's say, look at, I don't know, boardrooms of some top companies and say, I don't see myself there. It doesn't, I feel like I would be very out of place. I'm not really sure that world is for me. Now I'd say it's the same thing in reverse. I can imagine a lot of men looking at psychotherapy and thinking, well, that couldn't really be a career for me. That's the kind of that's what women do. Seriously, I like that. That's what middle-aged women do, because
Mm.
that's the profile of the most therapists that we've got.
It, you're right. Yeah, the BACP member survey found that 82 point something of members are women, and the average age is 53.
Yeah. So I mean, that's now again, as long as they're good therapists, I don't particularly care. But that is still a
Mm.
staggering number, and that tells us that there's been a real shift in the demographic of people choosing to pursue the vocation. So
There's also an interesting bit. I can't remember the exact figures, but an awful lot of those aren't working that many hours a week. So it's almost as though they're doing it as a kind of
mhm.
um, an interesting activity rather than to support their family and, you know, live. It's they're getting into it maybe later. Um,
Well, again, I think that's part of the draw of this notion that therapeutic training can help you with your own issues, which I'm not saying it doesn't do as a byproduct, but that should never be one of the primary drivers. But I think, again, if
mm,
trainees that I've known over the years, I think they were struggling with their own shit. And I think they saw that as an opportunity for them to kind of work it through and gain a qualification in the process. And that shouldn't be the primary motivator, you know. And I think a lot of people are drawn to practicing psychotherapy because, I don't know, because it makes them forget about how messed up their own lives are. I don't know. They get to
hmm
spend all their time with people who are struggling, and so it gives them a bit of a boost, I guess, as to their own issues. Again, I'm not saying that isn't a byproduct of this, and certainly, you know, some of the clients I work with, it certainly puts into perspective some of my own crap. It makes me realize that I complain and whinge about things far too often, and I've got no right to do so because there's a lot of people out there struggling a hell of a lot worse. But again, that should never be the primary motivator. There's
mm,
just too much navel gazing, too much self-obsession. Um, Again, on my training course, I remember there was we were talk one of the modules was about ethics more broadly and the type of clients people work with. And they went around, and most of my class were able to reel off all the different types of client they would refuse to work with, either because of the presentation or something about the client themselves. They were saying, well, if someone was, had been convicted of a criminal offense, I wouldn't work with them, or
okay.
if someone had X views, I don't think I could work with that because it would trigger me or whatever. And that, again, because I used to be a barrister, and there's something called the cab rank rule, which means that you take whatever client comes to you, so long as you've got the competency to work with them, irrespective of whether you think what they did was wrong, whether you think they're guilty, whether you like them as people. So I've always tried to carry that through into psychotherapy. I feel that psychotherapists actually owe that if you can work with someone, you should work with them, regardless of what you think of them.
Hmm. Yeah, something about basic decency, basic values, professional values. Do no harm, and if you can work with someone, meet that responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. Like anything else, I mean, we'd be in a dire state if, for example, GPs could just refuse to have consultations or prescribe to people because they didn't like their political opinion or because, they had a funny feeling towards them or whatever. I mean, like, you got to be able to move past that. Therapists should be able to role model that. Going back to what we were saying earlier about resilience and bracketing, all the rest of it, therapists should be able to role model that to their clients, not indulging
Mm.
it. And so, I don't know. I set up this directory of just therapy. It's based around principles that I think if therapists follow those, they can't go far wrong. So I'm glad there's an outlet now for people to turn to find therapists. But outside of that directory, I know a couple of other therapists who aren't part of the directory who I also do raise and think are very, ethical, but I wouldn't really know where else to recommend people to go towards. I genuinely don't trust most therapists, and that's not a good place to be. And when I was first training, and I sound so naive saying this, but I had a view that everyone would benefit from being in therapy. I remember I said that. I said, what could possibly be the harm? Because everyone's got issues. Everyone could use an opportunity to talk about it in a confidential space. And now I've
Mm.
completely changed my view. I think a lot of therapists are doing active harm to their clients. So
Maybe that's where we wind this up, depressing as it is, but sobering. And we need to hear this. We need to think about it and work out what to do. So it's really valuable hearing your experience, James, and all the work you're doing to try and contribute to this crisis in our profession. And maybe it's a public health crisis on a wider scale, like you intimated as well.
well, I hope that the tide turns. I hope that you and I are able to come back in a couple of years' time and have a conversation and the picture's looking rosier than it is at present. I'm not giving up hope just yet, but there's a lot of work to be done. But there are sane, sensible, ethical therapists out there. So we just got to come up with a plan of action, as far as I'm concerned. But I think we can do it. And I think the stakes are high enough that we should do it, right? Because we went into this profession for a reason, right? We love what it stands for. We love what it can be. We love what it can bring to people. So it'd be a shame to just lose all of that, some of these maddening ideologies. So
Mm.
we'll have another conversation in a while and see if things have improved.
Yeah, let's do it. And good luck with everything you're working on and with Just Therapy. How is that going, by the way, the platform?
It's good. It's good. I think what have we got? Probably 90 odd therapists in the UK on it. I've had a lot of interest from abroad, but I'm trying to keep it UK centric at the moment. And, every week we're receiving in referrals and people are interested. Um, it's a very saturated market. There's a lot of therapists out there. So, and I'm hearing from therapists generally that actually they're finding their client numbers maybe lower than they've experienced in the past. So I think there's a lot of competition out there. But, this was never really a business. It was just I wanted a place for people to turn to if they wanted an ethical therapist. So I'm very glad it exists, and I hope more therapists, and if there's anyone listening who feels aligned with what we're talking about, that they'll come and join us too.
Great. And could you point our viewers to where to find you, where to read your stuff?
Yeah. I spend too much of my life on X or Twitter, so that's just my name, James Esses. That's where I probably do most of my writing. I've got a Substack, again, which is in my own name, and I put out exposés or articles from time to time on there. And Just Therapy, it's just-therapy.org, and that's the directory. And you can, if you're looking for a therapist, you can search through different filters there. And if you want to join us, you can kind of send in an application form, and we'd be more than happy to have you.
Great. Really good talking to you, James.
Okay, thanks, Zach.
Thanks a lot. Go well.